The wind never really stopped blowing across the high plains. It sang through the brittle grass, stirred the dust along the fence line, and whispered against the old boards of a lonely ranch house that stood miles from the nearest neighbor. That was where Elias Turner lived alone, and by choice no one in town remembered exactly when he'd stopped coming in. Once a month, maybe twice a year, someone spotted him on horseback, bringing in hides or supplies. His beard had grown long and silver. His hat had seen more summers than most men in those parts. They said his eyes still carried the sharpness of a hawk, but they were the eyes of a man who had seen too much. Elias wasn't always a loner. Years ago, before the war and the drought, this ranch was alive. His wife, Clara, tended a small garden by the porch, and their little boy used to run barefoot across the dusty yard chasing chickens. But the West can be cruel. Disease took the boy, fever took the wife, and the silence took what was left of Elias's heart. Now he lived by a simple creed: work, eat, sleep, repeat. He mended his fences, tended his cattle, and rode his land at sunrise. He spoke only to the wind and to the ghost of his dog buried under the oak tree. But that autumn evening, the wind carried something different, a sound that didn't belong. It came from the far ridge, faint at first, like hoofbeats on dry earth. Elias paused, hand tightening around the rifle slung over his shoulder. Visitors were rare. Unwanted ones even rarer. He stepped onto his porch, scanning the horizon. The sun was melting into a sea of crimson clouds, throwing long shadows across the land. Out there, near the edge of the mesquite, he saw movement figures on horseback, slow and deliberate. 10 riders. At first glance, Elias thought they were ranch hands or travelers. But then the setting sun caught a flash of feathers, the glint of beaded leather, and he knew Apaches. He didn't move, just watched, heart steady but cautious. Out here, the past between settlers and tribes was painted in blood. He'd fought in one of those skirmishes years ago, and carried the scar on his shoulder to remember it now. 10 Apache riders were approaching his ranch straight and slow, not hiding, not threatening, just coming. Elias could have raised his rifle. He could have saddled his horse and ridden out before they reached the gate, but something in the stillness held him. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the echo of his old humanity. The lead rider lifted a hand in greeting. The others followed suit. Dust swirled around them as they drew closer, until Elias could see their faces, tired, hungry, weathered by travel. Not warriors on the hunt, refugees. The lead Apache, a man with gray braids and weary eyes, spoke in broken English. "We ask for shelter. Just one night." For the first time in years, Elias Turner felt the weight of another man's voice inside his home's silence. He didn't answer right away. The rifle hung loose at his side, but his mind raced through memories, through fear, through something he hadn't felt in a long time: compassion as the sun dipped behind the horizon. Elias finally nodded once and said the words that would change his life forever. "You can stay." One night, he didn't yet know that by sunrise, nothing on that ranch or in his soul would ever be the same again. Night fell like a curtain over the plains, swallowing the last red light of the sun and leaving the world wrapped in silver moonlight. Elias Turner stood by his porch as the 10 Apache riders dismounted near his corral. their silhouettes moving like shadows born from the dust itself. Their horses were gaunt and weary, the kind of tired that spoke of weeks without rest. The leader stepped forward, a tall man with gray braids, lines of wisdom carved deep into his weathered face. "My name is Taza," he said quietly, his English rough but clear. "We ride far, no fight, only shelter." Elias studied him for a long moment, the silence between them heavy as stone. He could feel the ghosts of his past stirring the battles he had fought, the friends he had buried, and the distrust that had hardened inside him over the years. Yet something in Taza's eyes wasn't the look of a warrior seeking conquest. It was the look of a man burdened by duty, by loss, and by the simple need to protect his people. Elias finally nodded toward the barn. "There's water and hay. Your horses can rest there," he said. The Apaches moved with quiet precision, tending to their mounts with care and reverence. Elias noticed one of them carrying a young woman wrapped in a faded blanket, her head resting limply against the rider's chest. Even in the dim lantern light, he could see the sheen of fever on her face. She looked barely alive. The sight pierced something inside him that had long been locked away. He turned, muttering to himself, and stepped inside his cabin. The place was small, one room, a cot, a stove, and a table scarred by years of solitude. He hadn't cooked for anyone but himself in more than a decade, but his hands moved automatically, setting a pot on the stove, fetching water from the pump, and breaking dried beans into the boiling pot. The door creaked open and Taza entered, ducking his head slightly under the frame. He stood silently, watching Elias work. "She is my daughter," Taza said softly. "The fever came 2 days ago. We had no medicine." Elias froze for a moment. The memory of his wife, Clara, lying weak in bed while he sat helpless beside her, flashed before his eyes. He swallowed hard and continued stirring the pot. "I've got some herbs," he said after a pause. "Not much, but they might help." For the first time that night, Taza's face softened with gratitude. "You have a kind heart, rancher," he said. Elias didn't reply. He wasn't sure he deserved that word anymore. He fetched a small tin box from a shelf, his old supply of dried herbs and remedies, and handed it to Taza. Together they treated the young woman, dampening her forehead and forcing a spoonful of medicine between her cracked lips. Outside, the others gathered near the barn, murmuring quietly in their own language, their silhouettes lit by the soft orange glow of a campfire. When Elias stepped back outside, he saw the youngest Apache tending the flames, roasting a piece of dried meat, his eyes watchful but not hostile. The scene was strangely peaceful, almost sacred. 10 strangers who should have been his enemies sat on his land, and yet he felt no fear, only a deep, unfamiliar calm. The night stretched on, and for the first time in many years, Elias did not eat alone. The night deepened over the plains, the stars sharp as cold steel against the black sky, and the ranch lay quiet except for the crackle of the campfire and the distant cry of a coyote. Elias Turner sat on his porch, rifle resting across his knees, watching the 10 Apaches gathered around the flames. They ate in silence, passing strips of dried meat between them, the smoke curling up into the night like a prayer. He hadn't seen human companionship in years, yet here were 10 souls former enemies by blood and history sharing his land. The old rancher's thoughts wandered as the firelight flickered across their faces. He remembered the early days when settlers and tribes clashed over every river and every blade of grass. He remembered standing shoulder to shoulder with soldiers, trading bullets for acres of land. He remembered what fear looked like on both sides. But these Apaches were not warriors seeking battle. Their faces were tired, their clothes worn. They looked like people running from something far worse than hunger. Inside his house, the young woman Taz's daughter lay under a thin quilt, her breathing ragged but steady. Elias had done what he could: herbs, water, a bit of whiskey to dull the fever. It wasn't much, but it was hope, and he hadn't felt that in a long time. When Taza joined him on the porch, the two men sat without speaking for a while, listening to the night. Finally, the Apache chief said quietly, "We came from the south. Soldiers burned our camp, took our food, our horses. We ride to mountains, maybe live again there." Elias kept his eyes on the horizon. He'd heard stories like that before: raids, reprisals, endless circles of revenge that never led anywhere but the grave. "You picked the wrong ranch," he muttered, half to himself. "Ain't much here worth saving." Taza looked at him with those steady, unblinking eyes. "Sometimes a roof is enough," he said. "Sometimes a man's word." Elias didn't answer, but something in that simple truth sank deep. They sat together for hours. Two men from different worlds, bound by the same exhaustion, the kind that comes from losing too much. Near midnight, the young Apache with the scar across his cheek approached and handed Elias a small carved figurine eagle with wings spread wide. "Gift," he said in halting English. Elias turned the carving over in his hands. It was rough, imperfect, yet full of life, the kind of thing that spoke more than words. "Why give this to me?" Elias asked. The young man shrugged. "You let us stay. The wind, remember?" Then he walked back to the fire, leaving Elias staring at the carving. For years, his home had been a tomb of silence and ghosts. Now, for one night, it breathed again with voices, warmth, and the faint rhythm of hope. When the fire burned low, Elias rose and checked on the girl once more. Her fever had broken. Her skin was cool to the touch. He exhaled slowly, realizing he'd been holding his breath for hours. Outside, Taza whispered something in Apache, a prayer, maybe a blessing. Elias didn't need to understand the words. He felt their meaning in his bones. He went back to his porch, sat down, and looked out at the endless dark plains. The loneliness that had ruled his life for so long was still there, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a curse. It felt like space to let something new in. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the horizon, turning the plains from black to gold, and Elias Turner was already awake, standing by the corral with a coffee tin warming over the embers of last night's fire. The air smelled of dust and ash, and the sound of horses snorting softly carried through the still morning. The Apaches were stirring, too silent, efficient, moving like the earth itself had taught them how to wake without disturbing the world. Taza's daughter slept inside, her fever broken, her face peaceful for the first time since they had arrived. Elias glanced toward the open door where the faint scent of herbs drifted out, and for a fleeting second, a strange pride filled him. He had saved a life. In a land where death was a daily visitor, that meant something. But the peace of morning was fragile. the kind that doesn't last long in the West. As Elias poured the bitter coffee into a tin cup, he noticed something on the ridge, a shimmer of movement, a glint of sunlight off metal. His stomach tightened. Through years of living alone, he'd learned to recognize danger before it came knocking. He squinted, shading his eyes, and saw them clearly now. Riders. 4, maybe 5. Soldiers. Cavalry, their blue coats bright even at a distance. They were moving slow but steady, their horses kicking up a thin trail of dust that shimmered like a ghost across the plain. Elias swore under his breath. If the army found Apaches on his land, things could turn bad fast. Taza noticed his gaze and followed it, his jaw tightening when he saw the riders. He turned to his people and spoke in low, sharp words. Instantly, they began moving, packing what little they had, ready to vanish into the land as they'd done countless times before. Elias hesitated. He could have let them go. It wasn't his fight. But when he looked at the sick girl lying inside her face, soft and fragile, the quilt rising and falling with each breath, he knew he couldn't just stand by. "Wait," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "They'll see you on the plain. Hide in the canyon by the creek. I'll deal with them." Taza looked at him, eyes narrowed in disbelief. "You would stand for us?" Elias nodded once. "For her," he said simply. Without another word, Taza signaled his people to move. Within minutes, they were gone, melting into the land like smoke, silent and invisible. Elias took a deep breath, wiped his hands on his coat, and walked toward the barn just as the soldiers approached. The lead rider, a young lieutenant with sharp eyes and a spotless uniform, pulled up near the fence. "Morning, sir," he called. "We're tracking a band of Apaches. You've seen anything unusual?" Elias leaned on his fencepost. Calm as ever, his voice flat. "Ain't seen much but wind and dust." The lieutenant studied him, suspicion flickering across his face. "Mind if we take a look around?" Elias shrugged. "Ain't much to see, but you're welcome to waste your time." The soldiers dismounted, searching around the barn and corral, finding nothing but an old rancher's solitude. After a few tense minutes, the lieutenant finally nodded. "If you see anything, report it to Fort Grant." Elias just tipped his hat. "Sure thing, Lieutenant." When they rode off, the tension drained from his body. He watched them disappear into the morning haze, then turned back toward the canyon. Taza and his people emerged from the rocks, silent but watchful. Taza met his eyes, understanding everything that had just passed without a word. He stepped forward, placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, and said simply, "Now we owe you more than shelter." Elias shook his head. "Just take care of her," he said quietly. As the sun rose higher, the light caught the small carved eagle still resting on the porch rail, its wings glinting like it was ready to fly. By midday, the sun blazed over the plains, turning the air thick and shimmering with heat. The soldiers were gone, their trail fading into the horizon like a bad dream. But the echo of their visit still hung heavy over the ranch. Elias Turner stood by the well, sweat glistening on his brow, watching as the Apaches gathered their things. He knew they couldn't stay much longer. Out here, word traveled fast, and sooner or later, more soldiers would come. Taz's daughter was sitting up now, her face pale but alive, her dark eyes studying the man who had saved her with a quiet intensity that made Elias uncomfortable. She said something softly in Apache, and Taza translated. She says, you gave her back the wind. Elias didn't know how to answer that. So he just nodded and went back to tightening the straps on a saddle that hadn't been used in months. The Apaches moved with calm efficiency, packing what little food and water they could find. The ranch, usually silent and dead, now felt alive: voices, movement, purpose. Elias found himself not wanting it to end, though he'd never admit it aloud. As he watched them prepare to leave, he noticed the youngest of the riders, a boy no older than 17, struggling to fix a broken stirrup. Without a word, Elias knelt beside him and helped, his rough hands steadying the leather strap. The boy smiled, shy but grateful. It struck Elias how little separated them, how the world had drawn lines between people who shared the same dust, the same hunger, the same need to belong somewhere. When the saddle was secure, Taza approached, his weathered face marked with something that looked like sorrow. We ride north to the mountains, he said. It will not be easy. Elias studied him for a long moment, then spoke quietly. Nothing worth keeping ever is. The two men clasped hands, not as strangers, but as equals, bound by something neither could name. Before leaving, Taza reached into a pouch and pulled out a small, folded piece of cloth, old, sun-faded, but carefully kept. He placed it in Elias's hand. My father's, he said, a token of peace. If ever you ride north, show this. They will know your name. Elias looked down at the cloth, an old Apache symbol woven into its fibers, a spiral sun surrounded by 4 arrows. It was a symbol of balance, of life and death, of the circle that never ends. He tucked it carefully into his coat pocket, feeling the strange weight of the gesture settle deep in his chest. As the Apaches mounted their horses, the girl gave Elias one last look. She didn't smile, but her eyes spoke all the words she couldn't say: gratitude, respect, maybe something more. Elias raised a hand in farewell, and Taza nodded once before leading his people toward the north, their silhouettes shrinking against the endless horizon until they vanished into the heat and dust. For a long time, Elias just stood there, alone again, but not quite the same. The ranch was silent once more, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was full of memory. He walked back to the porch and saw the carved eagle still perched on the railing, wings open as if caught mid-flight. He picked it up, turned it in his hand, and whispered, "Safe travels." The wind answered softly, carrying the faint echo of hoofbeats that would stay with him forever.